Welcome to the show, Sherry Welling.
It is really good to be here with you, Jason. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here after some tech snags. So we're going to get into one of my a topic I have very little experience with, grief, and we're going to go deep into that. And first, though, I just sort of gave you the formal intro of you, but how do you introduce yourself now?
Ooh, I enjoy having lots of different parts of me and lots of different parts of my life. But I think when people are asking for introductions, they're usually looking for a professional one. So for that, I'm a clinical psychologist who spends a lot of time taking care of the mental health needs of entrepreneurs. I also, as we'll jump in, have recently written a book about grief, which is both personal and professional for me. It's about the loss of my father and my brother. In my not professional life, I'm married to a cool guy named Rob and raising two almost teenage sons. And in my play life, I'm a circus artist. So I spend time training on the flying trapeze and the aerial silks.
Yeah, I'm so impressed with that art. My son and daughter do circus arts once a year with their school. Neither of them do the aerial, what did you call them? The silks? Is that what they're called?
Yeah.
Aerial silks? Yeah, so that's so impressive. So much strength. Dang.
Yeah, it's
awesome.
So fun. It's been a really lovely part of my life, especially these last few years.
Were you always into that, or is this a new sort of thing you got into?
It's new. It's new. I started when I was 39. So I'm 44 now. So I'm about 5 years in, but it was kind of like my midlife crisis athletic activity. I also moved from California to Minnesota. And so I loved to surf. I'd spent a lot of time outside. And so when I moved to Minnesota, I really needed an indoor activity for the winter and randomly found circus arts. And it's been really quite perfect for me.
Yeah, that's so cool. All right. Grief. Now, there's so many places I could start. Why don't we start with you lost your father to cancer and your brother to suicide. And I'm just going to make the assumption that that's where this book came from because of loss, right? And I was prefacing before we hit record that I haven't lost parents, I haven't lost siblings, or even a best friend. So this is an area where I just have a lot of curiosity and not a lot of firsthand experience. So I'm just grateful for your book and for what you're about to share here. So yeah, I'm assuming that's what launched you into writing this book and facing loss.
As a psychologist, I trained really as a focus in trauma and traumatic stress. That's how I spent, the vast majority of the first chunk of my career. So I'd had a lot of kind of professional conversation about grief and trauma, but I didn't ever feel moved or called to writing a book about that. Like, grief was a part of my work, but it wasn't really the heart of what I wanted to focus on in my work. But when I experienced these personal losses, I started writing about what I was experiencing and what I was observing in myself and in those around me. And that's really what this book became. In a way, it started as kind of my journal, but has grown in iteration since then to be more something that's, written for other people. But I think in a lot of ways, this book is me trying to put together my personal experience and my professional experience into something that made sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Well, can we define grief? How would you describe grief?
I think quite simply, it's the set of emotional reactions to loss. And loss takes lots of forms, right? We often think about death as the precursor to grief. But of course, there are many, many losses that have with it a set of feelings that we can categorize as grief, whether that's the loss of a relationship, the loss of a job, the loss of a business. Mm-hmm. I think even in COVID, we really learned what it feels like when we lose all of our plans and a lot of our control, right? There are lots of feelings that go along with that too.
Yeah. And our social seeing each other just in person, right?
Yeah.
And I want to back up actually to how you became a psychologist did you study grief and trauma as a psychologist? And before that, what had you even enter into the field of psychology?
I think the path to becoming a psychologist for most people, myself certainly included is in many ways I was raised to be a psychologist. I
Yeah.
grew up in a family that was, we had a lot of things going for us, loving in a lot of ways. But something that was never done was to speak about difficult things or speak about emotional things.
Yeah.
And so my role as the oldest daughter in that family was to observe the dynamics, to anticipate the needs, to kind of figure out what was happening without words. And in a lot of ways, that's a really good skill set for being being a mental health professional,
Completely.
right? Very observational, very able to read between the lines, very sensitive. And so I, originally wanted to study medicine, and then I took organic chemistry in college, and that was pretty much miserable. And I thought, well, maybe this isn't really for me. Maybe the medical field isn't where it should be. And so I ended up in psychology a little bit as a default, but it really has been a wonderful career for me. I found that I really love the experience of helping to calm people down, as opposed to the work of helping to wake people up, if that makes sense. So for me, that's led to a career that has focused on serving people who are really activated, anxious, agitated, traumatized. So I've done a lot of work with people in the military, with military families, with ER physicians, with people who have just really, really high intensity lives and need some support in kind of coming back to a place of calm or equanimity.
Yeah. Did you start in private practice, or were you starting at an agency, or how did you get
I
your
started
start?
as an academic. Yeah, I was a researcher. Had really cool opportunities to train at Yale University School of Medicine. And then I went on to the National Center for PTSD, which is in Boston. Wow. And so I thought that I would make my mark in the world as a researcher. But in many ways, it wasn't as creative and artistic as I feel like I now know myself to be. So I really was drawn much more to clinical work over time, and to sort of non-traditional ways of thinking about clinical work, like retreats and ways to show up for people that are a little bit outside the confines of the sort of 50-minute therapy room.
Yeah.
So the creativity that has become part of my adult life has been really important to me. Probably not super well suited for life as a researcher.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, research is a whole path, a whole different path, I think.
It's cool in lots of ways, but ended up just not being right for me.
Yeah. Now, if we come back to your brother and your father and your family of origin, will you help us? Because there's a lot of people listening who are therapists, psychologists, coaches, healers, helpers, and we're all pretty hip to the fact that most of us grew up in families where we were the ones tracking the kind of system relationally or emotionally, or we had an addict in the family, or we had a depressed parent, or we had a mental health problem, sibling or something. So when it comes to your brother's mental health, I'm so curious, looking back, is that pretty clear that there were challenges in the system that for whatever reason he just had a harder time, and then how did your family deal with that? And does it of course make sense later when he committed suicide or not?
I think my brother's name was Dave, but his path is a little bit murky to me in those early years. He's 7 years younger than me. So much of his coming into adolescence and high school happened after I'd left home. In our childhood, I knew him as this very sweet, playful, very, very lovely, kind of well child. And so there was never this system-wide understanding that Dave has depression or Dave is drinking. We knew in high school that things were not well. He was getting in trouble and certainly struggling with alcohol and, marijuana use, things like that, getting in trouble at school, getting caught.
Yeah.
But there wasn't, it was such a slow burn in a way. There wasn't this deep dive crisis early on in his life. In a way, it was a set of 1,000 different moments and 1,000 different decisions. He had a baby quite young, when he was 19. And that meant that he was then trapped in this really adult situation with child support, and just all of these like really heavy factors that for him, as somebody who really wasn't probably ready for a lot of that responsibility, ended up being kind of an experience of lots and lots of failure. So I can't say that I could look at a memory of Dave when he's like 10 or 14 or 18 or even 25 and like predict this outcome. But also at the same time, when I look back over all of these sort of turns that his life took, I understand how he got there.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, is part of the grieving process for you and for the listener here, just, it seems like to me it's making meaning, right? Like what, there's this shock, there's this like sort of, is it Kubler-Ross, the stages of grief, or that one goes through and one then has to like reconcile like the meaning of like why and how did we get here, sort of. Is this very typical?
Yeah. I think especially with suicide is its own grief process because it has the illusion of choice. It has the illusion of maybe this didn't have to be the outcome. I've wrestled with this a lot in my own life, and it certainly shows up in the book, this difference between my dad's death to cancer and my brother's death to suicide, because the suicide has with it all of these questions. What could have been done? How could this have been prevented? And I think that set of questions makes meaning making difficult. It also makes grief related to suicide very private, very hard, very painful, because there's inevitably for everyone in that person's life some wrestling that must be done with blame and responsibility and prevention. And so I'm definitely no exception to that. There were many, many wrestlings for me of, if I hadn't said this, or if I had done that, if I'd said yes to this request. And, ultimately for me, I found that probably I wasn't that powerful, right? There were lots of things that I did wonderfully in my love for my brother. There were a few things that, I'd sure like to edit out of the story, but like were real and happened. And because I'm human,
Yeah.
But I think letting go of that conversation in my head has been really important to my well-being.
Yeah, so I'm kind of indirectly hearing a lot of advice there for the listener. If someone has struggled with the loss of someone to suicide, do you have any other, just a nugget for them that if someone has dealt with a suicide, just, I'm kind of hearing like, it's not your fault type of, Yeah,
I mean, I wish it could be that simple as I could say, hey, by the way, this happened and it's not your fault. But in a way, that's one of the most deepest things that you hold and you have to struggle with. I think that the whole conversation around choice as it relates to suicide is very deceptive. We want to say this person chose to die. They did this on purpose. They did this because their life was meaningless, or they did this because they weren't loved well. And really, none of those things are totally true. They're truth-ish, but they're not really true. I think that some point in the future in the world, we'll be able to see into the brains of people who have struggled with deep suicide. And we'll see that there's probably some kind of organic injury in the brain that's not unlike cells that are broken due to cancer, right? It's some disruption in the well-being of the organ. And that's not to let anybody off the hook, but actually maybe it is. Maybe it is to say like the brain was broken. And how it got there is a complicated question, but it usually never boils down to one relationship or one conflict or one fight or one thing.
Yeah, I'm hearing a more kind of holistic kind of view possibility here, that there's probably a multi-factor approach or reasons, right? Yeah.
One of the ways that I wrote about this was this sense in which, people want to ask the question why, and there's no answer to that, and then there's 10,000 answers. Right. There's 10,000 moments that led to this outcome. There's no one thing.
Yeah, that's well said. And then with the loss of your father to cancer, describe maybe the difference there and what you were personally navigating.
Yeah, I think my dad's death in many ways. The lessons of that were in walking with him through treatment, through his fights to try to stay alive. My dad was diagnosed with stage 4 esophageal cancer that had metastasized to his lungs and to his liver when he was diagnosed. So that's a very, very bad prognosis. I think the percentage of people that live like longer than 5 years is in the single digits with that level of diagnosis.
Yeah.
And so we all dealt with that in a really different way. Like I'm the geeky scientist one. So I looked up the statistics and I sort of knew like, oh wow, sorry, Dad, like this is going to kill you. Like this is the end of the story for you. And my dad is this, he's just a lifelong athlete, loves Indiana basketball, like just this fighter, and loves inspirational sports stories. And I say this because I think that was his approach to this cancer, was like, I'm going to be the one of the 100 that survives this. And that approach was hopeful in some ways. And in some ways it was really hard because it kept us from having really important conversations about his death, because he was all in on the fight. And so when I would be like, hey, Dad, we should probably talk about like life insurance and, what are your wishes? And those were conversations that weren't really accessible to him.
Right. That's so interesting, because he was so focused on healing, and then he might perceive you guys as not believing in him if you start asking these questions, right?
Yeah. And I think it felt like we all have to be all in. And so that, there's obviously a family system at play there. But when my dad did die, he was in hospice for like a week, which in a perfect world you're in for much longer because you're more comfortable, you have more support, there's more preparation. But when he did enter that phase, we, my mother and I were really, really present for him in the last week of his life. And we were all with him when he died, my mother and myself and both of my brothers. And that was actually a very important, profound, kind of sacred experience of physically comforting him, being present with him, being in the bed next to him when he took his last breath. It was a very intimate experience, and really was very important to me. And then stood in very stark contrast to my brother dying far away, without touch, without comfort, without people around him. And that, I think, has sort of shaped those griefs differently.
Yeah, completely. I was appreciating the description of the funeral of your father, and just, you were like, he would have liked to be there. Just the way the whole thing went down, and then obviously the challenging sermon thing that went down. But, and you have some advice in your book on how to navigate that also. It's like practical. It's just like, hey, here's like a funeral, and
by the way, memorial services are terrible. Like they're just always complicated. When you talk about relationships, family dynamics, right? Everyone has a relationship to this person who's lost, and everyone is bringing their relationship to that service. And so there's all kinds of different needs said and unsaid. There's all kinds of different feelings said and unsaid. And then you've got a group of like emotionally charged people who are trying to make decisions and like share a meal together. And I think even really, really healthy families just struggle to make their way through that kind of day. And so I think it's been really helpful to have really open conversations with people about like, hey, this is a day to get through. There may be some really beautiful moments in that memorial service, and that's wonderful. If they happen, take them as like this beautiful gift. But generally speaking, don't think that this day, this service, is going to be the crux of your grieving experience, because it's just sort of a family shit show in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And it seems like grief, often my experience of people grieving is, especially if they're not willing to grieve, but it's in there, is there's a lot of low level agitation and irritability and prickliness. Yeah.
I felt the way that I described it, like I felt like I was walking around with like a really bad sunburn, and like any touch, any pressure, any like, if I just brushed against something, it hurt.
Mhm.
And so that sense of walking around sort of irritable, walking around sort of self-protective, walking around in this state of like hypervigilant protection, I think is really what grief feels like, because you're so sensitive and you're
Yeah.
so vulnerable and you just can't take any more anything in the most acute phases.
Yeah. And so in my naive sort of beginnerness of grief, is it kind of like we have to actually feel our feelings? Is it that basic? And are they just massive or big or small waves that move through us? And at a certain point, we know when we're done. Is it that sort of straightforward, or is it way more complicated than that?
I think it depends. I know, irritating therapist answer. Um, in many ways, my grief around my dad is what I would call like non-complicated grief. He got cancer. We knew he was going to die. We were there with him. He died. It's very sad for me to walk around in the world without a father. You know, sometimes I feel a little orphaned. I
Mm,
feel young. I feel unprotected. But I also there's a correctness to the timeline, right? I'm an adult, and his deep work with me, raising me, is done. So that feels relatively uncomplicated. And that means that, yes, I think that there will be grief around the loss of my dad, always a little bit in different contexts. So every Thanksgiving, every Super
yeah.
Bowl, my dad was a big sports guy. So the Super Bowl is like high holy holiday. So there are these reminders that invite grief again, but it
Hmm.
doesn't feel unpredictable or overwhelming. It's kind
Yeah.
of part of me.
Yeah.
My brother's death, because it was more traumatic and also disrupts the circle of things, right? He was 33. He was supposed to grow old with me. Like, I was supposed to be calling him when I'm 70 to be like, hey, remember that time you lost your kayak in the river? You know, like,
Yeah.
he's my cohort in my family. And that feels different. It feels more disruptive. And I think the traumatic nature of his death has with it a little bit more of those like trauma-ish symptoms
Hmm.
that every once in a while just overtake me. And I just have this like sense of overpowerful, like, I cannot believe that he's gone. He is
Yeah.
not supposed to be gone.
Right.
So
Yeah.
grief does change over time. It's not always acute,
Hmm.
but I do think it kind of rewrites us, because it does rewrite some of our important identities. Sort of like
Completely.
going from being married to being divorced. It's a
Hmm.
shift in identity. I used to be a daughter with a dad and a sister with a brother, and I'm not anymore. And
Right.
those identities shifted sort of permanently.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's a helpful distinction between those two. And what about let's talk about, because the listener also is probably dealing with divorce, like you just said,
Mm.
breakups, and some people really have a hard time here, like a literal death of a loved one. Can you describe maybe some of the differences in what we can do to face loss like that?
Yeah, I think naming it as loss is really important. You know, I think sometimes people don't, they do the dissection into, well, this is why I left, or this is why they left. Like, they get really cognitive about it
Hmm.
and don't drop into that emotion space of like, regardless of why or how or who said what to whom, this is sad.
Yeah.
It's sad. And there's deep loss. And when there's deep loss, there's grief. And I think that grief needs space. It needs time. It needs to be acknowledged. And so when we, especially with the case of a divorce, if we stay really heady, we never give that kind of
Hmm.
healing air to our grief. And often it's in memorializing the experience. So having some ritual around taking off wedding rings, around um, saving or not saving certain personal memorabilia of that person. You know, it's in
Deleting
these
Facebook
exercises.
photos or
Exactly.
yeah.
Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And there's reasons why.
Hmm.
I think bringing other people into our grief too is important. In death, you do get, there is a service. People bring a potluck. There's sort of not a lot, but there's some cultural norms around how to support someone who's lost someone to death. There are no cultural norms around how you show up for the person that you're friends with who's getting divorced. And I wish there were, because that would be very helpful, right?
Yeah.
The sort of friend's guide to the grief of divorce.
Yeah, that's cool. I haven't thought of that. I recently had a friend get a divorce, and he did his own, really powerful rituals around it. That was important for him to let go. And, often there's like a shared house or shared land or shared something. And it's like even selling it is like nope, I need to make room for the new by sort of clearing out the old, Hey, if you want to uplevel your life, your relationship life specifically, I want you to consider our Relationship Mastery program. It's 9 months of complete transformation where you become a better listener, a better communicator, you learn how to have secure relationships, and you get an experiential taste of that. You feel seen and supported and challenged to reach your relationship goals. And really, you become a better communicator. So many people have gone through this course now. And we have a done with you version of it now, which is amazing, where you get assigned a private relationship coach. You get to do live group coaching with me once a month and ask me anything you want. There's office hours where you get to meet with one of our coaches to nerd out on the curriculum. And the community is very strong. And these are people who care a lot about relationships, and they want to get what they want to get, which is they want to be in a relationship and not betray themselves, right? They want to get the relationship they want while being true to themselves. That's what most of us want. And this course is the path for you to get that. Here's what one of our participants in the past has said about this course.
When I started Deeper back in February, I was in a space just coming out of a 25-year marriage, and this is my second marriage. So feeling like, I don't have this relationship stuff down. I'm not at all the same person. There's so much that has changed about me after being through this experience that I'm almost unrecognizable in my relationship capacity. And I've had people mention that to me, like, what are you doing? You're so happy, you're so strong and confident. What have you been doing? I have taken my power back in making decisions for myself, caring for myself, in choosing who I surround myself with. I relate differently to people now, and I speak my needs, which I did not do before, set boundaries with people. Absolutely would recommend Deeper to anyone, no matter where you're at in your path with relationships, even if you feel like you're strong. I believe that Jason and his program gives such a unique perspective that even if you feel like you're strong in your relationships, you will learn something. And then if you're feeling like you are struggling, coming into this space, you will learn tools, you'll get confidence and support.
All right. Amazing words from one of our heartfelt students here at the Relationship School. If you want to change your life like they did, go to relationshipschool.com/relationship mastery, and we'll see you in there. And so, okay, what I notice of people over the years of helping people through breakups and divorce is some people stay stuck and some people are able to move through. And I'm curious if you've seen that, and what is the difference of someone who really feels like it really takes them out, maybe for years, particularly with divorce or a breakup.
Yeah, I certainly have seen that. And I think from my own grief journey, one of the things that's not often spoken about, but is really helpful, is pouring one's energy into the creation of something new.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean a new relationship. Like, I think it can mean a hobby, a new passion, a something, because there is all of this active emotional material. And the danger is that it stays attached to the person that we're leaving or that we've left.
Yeah.
It stays attached to the past. And I'm not somebody who's like, put the past in the past, let's move on. Like, I don't believe that. I don't believe that's a recipe for mental health. I don't believe that's realistic. No. We take it with us, but we have some choices around how we take it with us. So I think the difference between folks who get stuck and folks who don't is how intentionally they are carrying that big emotional power, and whether it is moving forward into something that they're choosing, like for me, circus arts or writing a book or making something out of those sort of shreds of their past emotional experience, or whether it's sort of stuck in the past.
Yeah. In your case, it looks, just from the limited, I've studied you and your work here, is that it looks to me like death and birth sort of go hand in hand. That I lose something, there's a loss, I let go of it, and there's room for now the new thing, the birth of some new creative endeavor or a new relationship. Do you experience it as that straightforward? At least in concept, in theory?
Yeah. I mean, that is the book is titled Touching Two Worlds because it's my reflection on being in the world of death, loss, grief, pain, illness, and then also figuring out how to go back and forth between that world and the world of joy, of play, of raising kids, of being ambitious, of having a career. So I feel like it's a passport between the two lands in a way. Yeah. And the more fluidly you can move back and forth between them, the better it is.
That's health, right?
Yeah.
That feels like health to me.
It's not to say, though, that hard world doesn't exist, but nor is it to say that joyful world is frivolous and doesn't exist either. It has to be the both and. And I have found that relationship that you've alluded to between birth and death to be really, really true. So much so that even as my dad was dying, I thought so much about what it felt like when I had little infants. Because it's the same tending to a body. It's the same listening for breath. It's the same, like, are they cold? Are they warm? Like, wow. It's this very embodied caretaking. So I went a little literal with that, but I think that same love is possible in both of those experiences. And that's, for me, the through line between the dark death world and the bright becoming world.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I had a teacher once in graduate school say that when we talked about death and dying, he talked about, in his experience as a therapist for 40 years or whatever, he was saying that people go into death sort of two different ways. One is they're like gripping like this and just terrified, and their back is facing death. And then other people are sort of open arms, turning toward death in the dying process. I'm curious what you think about that.
That resonates. I think when we have our eyes open and we're looking at the full range of what it means to be human, death has got to be part of that. When we're afraid, when we segment off the things that we're afraid of, whether it's the loss of a partner or the loss of our lives, that kind of gripping, that kind of internal angst, I think just creates more suffering than is necessary.
I'm with you. Yeah, that feels true to me too. I just think the fluidity you talked about in the touching the two worlds metaphor is so, man, just to have that range. And I think it's why feeling our feelings is so important, and going into, quote, the darkness of whatever hard experience we're going through in our life, because down in there somewhere is this like fertile ground for this new emerging birth of some kind.
There's a team at Johns Hopkins that's been doing work with psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in mushrooms, so psychedelic intervention, with people who are terminally ill, so really kind of preparing to die. And that work it's really interesting because the effect of that particular medicine really for some people, draws them into kind of this spiritual place. And so in this intervention that they've been testing at the university, they're really helping people to do what you described, that open-hearted, open-eyed, almost embracing of death as part of the journey of their life. And I'm sure you don't have to use a psychedelic substance in order to get there, but it is quite interesting that this team is looking at this as an intervention. And when people go through this treatment, they do have this sense of peace and even curiosity, or sometimes even joy, about their approaching death in the way that is pretty healing for them and for their families and for kind of everyone around them.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of an interesting, like, what if we could all approach our deaths with curiosity and peacefulness?
Yeah. Yeah. I've talked to my dad, actually. He's 82, about psilocybin. And he's on the fence right now, but we're talking about it.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a lot potentially in the way for him to relax a little bit. So we'll see where that goes. Yeah. But I appreciate that medicine, and also like death doulas and people who are hospice and just people who are like really showing up for the transition is like so amazing to me.
Oh, yeah. It's a really beautiful sort of emerging field that I think makes all the difference in how those who are left alive, how they cope with their grief.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that I think about a lot is the difference between my experience of my dad's death and my brother's experience of my dad's death, because we were both present when he died.
Right.
And I left that feeling like I'd had a very like sacred experience. My brother left that same moment, stole the medicine from the hospice, drank liquid lorazepam, drank liquid morphine, and went looking for alcohol and ended up in jail. So, I mean, if there's, I don't even know how to kind of understand that dichotomy, but we had really, really different experiences of the same moment. And I do think that that's why in some ways I wrote the book. It's why I want to really talk about grief, because grief can be really unraveling for people.
Yeah.
And I think it wasn't the cause of my brother's death by any stretch of the imagination, but it certainly contributed to him feeling unstable and unwell. So I forgot why I started talking about that, but
well, I think it's just
if we don't do grief well, it can be dangerous, I guess.
Yeah, and to me, for especially the men out there listening, it's like we're so conditioned to not feel still in this culture as boys, but it just comes down to, can we allow ourselves to be impacted and feel our experience, right? And I think it's so basic, but when I remember my journey to learn how to feel after 3 decades of not feeling, it was hard and it was terrifying to begin to open up my being to feel what was actually going on inside. So I get it, for some of us anyway, how scary.
Yeah.
But as one of my teachers said, he's like, well, let's find out if it's going to kill you. Just like, if you stay with it.
Let's see.
Let's find out. Yeah. How do we talk to kids about grief, grieving? I mean, there's so many angles here, and you have a chapter, I think, in your book. Is it how to talk to your kids about death? Is that what the chapter is?
There's one specifically about suicide, how to talk to kids about suicide. Yeah, and I was thinking about that as you were talking about your own experience going through 30 years of your life not feeling, because I'm raising sons, little boys who've seen quite a lot of loss and death. My sons, they knew both, obviously, my father and my brother quite well. Dave spent a lot of time at our house with us in the last few years of his life. And my dad, when he was diagnosed with cancer, actually came, my family lives in Minnesota, relatively near Mayo Clinic. And so he came for treatment there and, was in our house for 2 months when he was going through chemo. And so my kids had a front row seat to all of that. And I think in many ways, I hope that it's helping them learn how important grief is early in their lives, so they're just integrating it as one of the human experiences. And it's been really important to have very open, I think, conversations about, when it was clear that my dad would die, we told the kids, there's no need to be unclear. There's no need for any guesswork. There's no need to play coy. It doesn't save their feelings. It doesn't save their pain in any way. So I really believe in being quite open with children. Same with my brother's battle with alcohol. Like, this is what's happening. Like, Uncle Dave is addicted to this substance and it's wreaking havoc in his brain. So simple, straightforward, but very honest conversation, I think, is so important in any really important matter, but especially these matters of illness and grief.
Yeah, and it seems like the reminder I've noticed with kids too, depending on their age, of course, but if mom or dad is really in it in terms of the grief and lots of tears, and they can hear them in the other bedroom sobbing, and it's sort of like also sending the message simultaneously, like, I got me, so you don't need to take care of me, because a lot of children naturally want to take their parents' pain away.
Yeah.
That feels important too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was a hard one for me, because I was gone a lot, seeing and helping and being with my dad and brother at the end of their lives. And then I was certainly affected. And so I worried quite a bit about, like, is this overburdening them?
Mm-hmm.
Is it too much? Is it costing them too much for me to be so much a part of these stories? Which I think was actually very healthy for me to ask, because that's the other thing that as care is a little bit gendered in our society. As the oldest daughter, like, my job was like, show up for those doctor's appointments, like, help out. That was the messaging that I carried with me. And I did some of that, and some of it I did not do. But I think it was important to really ask the question, what is this costing my family, my other, my nuclear family, my kids?
Yeah.
And be really protective of that energy for them.
That's cool. Well, and they get to see you actually make the journey, though, of like facing all of these challenges and continuing to stand up and face your life and hold your job down and your relationships and that's also a super powerful teaching, no matter how long it takes you, is like, mom's a warrior. She's like facing all this stuff and still able to live her life. What a download.
Yeah. I think too, I'm proud of this part of the story, Jason, like, because I was going to yoga a lot. I was doing circus training. I just was moving, and I would sort of explain to my kids, like, sometimes I'm kind of like trying to outrun the sadness. So I got to go run around the lake, or I got to go to circus. Like, I just got to keep going so that I don't feel like it's too much sadness for me. And so I would have, I'd say, like, I'm trying to balance, like, the fun and play with the sad and heavy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they understood that. They understood that.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, again, I just think what a beautiful transmission over time for them to see that.
I do feel like it's something like I would love for all parents to help their kids be grief literate and help them understand that that the deaths that we experience over the course of our life are really important to be present to pay attention to. They don't have to overwhelm us, but they are important. That all of the losses that we encounter. In a way, I've been thinking about it sort of like sex education, right? Like, if the only conversation that you're having about sex is when your kid is like 17 and going to college, and you're like, hey, by the way,
right,
that's really too late in the journey for that conversation.
Totally.
And similarly, like, if the only conversation you're having around grief is like on the way to grandma's memorial service, I feel like that's a little late in the game.
Mm-hmm.
And so early on in life, for you to weave that in, just as you're hopefully weaving in like sex positive parenting and how to take care of your body and all of those things. So are you weaving in the lessons around death as part of life, and how we hold grief, how we hold sadness and loss.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, every relationship ends, right? And that's just, that alone is like, whoa, if you stop and think about it, it's like, oh, that's true. My marriage is going to end, whether, we're not going to get a divorce most likely, but it's like someday it's going to end because I'm going to die or my wife's going to die.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's be real about that, and let's like turn toward that. And a couple more questions before we wrap up here, Sherry. This is super enriching. And we'll talk about where folks can get the book if they want to go deeper here. I have a strange question that years ago, one of my mentors, who's very odd, but brilliant in his own way, taught some completely different frame around grief than I've ever heard, and still have never heard anyone else talk about it. And his model is or his sort of idea, and I've played with this, so it's interesting. I just wanted to get your take. Is people are grieving what they're grieving, and why people get stuck is because they're grieving the fantasy of who they think the person is, or they're infatuated with certain qualities of their person rather than seeing them as like a real sort of person with all kinds of faults and etc. People can, and this is where it's really hard for partner. Like if I'm in a dysfunctional relationship and it ends and I'm with some really person who's really bad to me, the person's grieving the loss of the fantasy, not the actual person. What do you think about that? That creates even more pain for a person because they're, it's not like they were actually grieving the loss of this real human. They were grieving just a bunch of fairy tales about him.
Yeah, I think so what comes up for me is a very difficult, well, actually, maybe not difficult, like a very open conversation that my mom and I have that goes something like, it's really good that Dave isn't suffering anymore, which turns a little bit into like, we're at peace with the fact that he's dead and gone and not in that story anymore. And I bring this up in this context because I think sometimes it's easy to focus on like the emptiness of the loss of the person, but also of the potential of what would have been, what could have been.
Yeah.
So people who really get stuck, I think, in grief have a lot of uncompleted work with that human. And there's never the opportunity to go back and repair that relationship. There's never the opportunity to fix it, which is maybe a little bit akin to this sense of you lose the fantasy of them. You lose the hope for what could have been, of who you could have been to them. And yeah, I guess it makes sense to me, your mentor's idea that there's something in the fantasy world that you're missing as well, and that can trap you if you let it.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and he also actually alluded to what you just said about like a suicide family or a person who's really ill. Often in a system, there's a collective relief in a strange sort of way. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Or like a really practical way. I mean, people who are in a family with people who love people who are dealing with addiction or significant mental health concerns. I mean, there's lots of midnight phone calls. There's lots of like weird car accidents. There's lots of chaos that the system absorbs. And when that is gone, there is a collective like sigh of, okay, I am not going to get any more midnight phone calls. I'm not going to be in the ER cleaning up blood. Like, okay, there's relief in that.
Right. And I would just encourage, if anyone's listening feeling this, that like guilt can be another emotion that could come up, like that I feel relieved. And I think that that also makes sense. And that it's okay to feel relief, I think, is what we're saying.
Yeah.
In those kind of situations.
I wouldn't trade it. I mean, I would take the midnight phone calls to have my brother back, but like, it's not a choice I've been offered. Nice. So I'm also taking the pain alongside, sleeping better some nights because I'm not disrupted. Yeah.
Yeah. That's helpful. Well, Sherry, it's been awesome. Final question we ask all our guests. One of our missions here at the Relationship School is to reach young people with relationship education. And I'm curious, if I had a room full of 1,000 young adults and I could only teach them one thing about love or relationships or even grief, and you were whispering in my ear, what would you want me to tell them?
Ooh, big question. I think something to the effect that there's no corner of your experience that you need to be afraid of. That whatever feeling, whatever dream, whatever fear, like those things can be, you can look at them, you can access them. They won't overwhelm you.
Amazing. Yes. Feel the feels, people. Whew. All right, Sherry, where can we find the book and you, and if people want to follow up with you? And
so the book is called Touching Two Worlds, and it's It's in all the spots. So it's on Amazon, it's in your local bookstore, it's Barnes and Noble, wherever you get your books, you should be able to find it there. And I'm on the internet as at Sherry Walling on Instagram and Twitter, and I'm on LinkedIn. And then there's actually a website about the book, which is kind of interesting. It has some backstory into my family's life. It also has some interesting ways that I've integrated my circus love and this theme of grief. That's a topic of a TED Talk that I'm doing in October. So kind of getting creative with circus and grief. And that, there's some cool videos and things like that on the website. And that's touching2worlds.com.
I was just going to say, okay, touching2worlds.com and sherrywalling.com.
Yep.
Okay. We'll put those in the show notes. All right. Amazing. Sherry, thanks again for all that you do and for facing your life and just sharing it.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Jason. It's been a wonderful conversation.
All right. Go to sherrywalling.com and touching2worlds.com. You'll learn more about Sherry and her book, published by Sounds True. And I think grief is, it's fascinating to me. And I felt, as I listened to this, as I was with Sherry, I just felt tender almost the whole time, because we're just talking about such intimate, tender, vulnerable things: death, dying, ending relationships, suicide. Whew. So I think the action step, there's many here, other than go to sherrywalling.com, of course, for your own journal and a conversation starter with you and your partner or a friend is, what is your relationship to grief? And do you allow yourself to fully feel when things end in your life, whether it's a death or a metaphorical death? Are you creating the kind of space to honor how you feel? Are you doing that? And what are you going to do about that if not? And do you need accountability? Do you want to enroll a friend and say, look, instead of feeling my feelings, I'm distracting. And I'd like to create space so that I can just be with the pain. Whew. Thanks so much for listening, as always. And I wish you well today, tonight, this morning, and stay connected. If you live in the United States and you want to receive text messages from me about my personal life or little daily reminders, you can do that now. It's so cool. You just need to text the number 720-704-4852, or you can go to my.community.com/Jason Gaddis. And that way you can sign up for text. And if you just text me podcast, I know you came from the podcast, and I will be sending you text messages. You can always stop at any time just by typing in STOP. All right? Yeah, I look forward to connecting with you on your phone, folks. As you know, I've dedicated my life to helping people with their relationships, right? I want to solve this problem so that all of you can work through your differences and have fulfilling, amazing, badass partnerships and relationships, family, coworkers, friends, whoever. And I have trained a ton of relationship coaches, almost 100 certified relationship coaches, to help you specifically work through your relationship challenges. So I want to invite you to a special deal we're offering to the podcast listener, where you can get 50% off your first month of coaching with one of our amazing relationship coaches. Okay, if you're tired of therapy, it feels like that's going around in a circle, or you want to actually set goals and accomplish your relationship goals, hire a relationship coach. Okay, go to relationshipschool.com/get coaching now, and then use the coupon code FIRST50 to get the 50% deal off your first month of relationship coaching. Super psyched to have our amazing coaches serve you and help you get to the next level. Hey, thanks so much for listening. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel. Share one of these videos with a friend. We want to help the planet get their act together around relationships, and you are one of them, so thank you.